The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's monthly Act and Learn webinar. Tonight's topic is disability rights and reproductive justice. Joining you tonight are your hosts. The first voice you are hearing is me, Erin Matson. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction, and I'm based in Arlington, Virginia.
And this voice is Pamela Merritt. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. The agenda for tonight is that I'll do a quick introduction of Reproaction for people who are not familiar with our organization. And then we'll have an overview of disability rights and reproductive justice. Following that overview, there'll be a panel discussion with our presenters, Jack Kimmy Gutierrez from We Testify, David Perry, who is a journalist, and then Amanda McCray, Women Enabled International. And following that panel discussion, there'll be an overview of some next steps and how people can take action. And then we'll have a Q&A, and then we will adjourn promptly because that's how we roll. For the Q&A, if you have questions, please drop them in the question tab of your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. And then the hashtag for live tweeting is #Reproaction. So who are Reproaction? We are a new direct action group formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, of our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition. And we're super proud of our commitment to nonviolent direct action.
Okay.
And with that, Erin.
Thank you, Pamela. So first, before we get into our fascinating panel discussion, I'd like to talk a little bit about the intersections of disability rights and reproductive justice. So that we have some common definitions, here's what I'm working from tonight. Disability rights is a movement that strives for equal treatment, equal access, and equal opportunities for people with disabilities. And reproductive justice concerns the right to parent, the right not to parent, and the right to raise families in safe and healthy communities. Now, I want to be really clear that when we're talking about people who are concerned about disability rights personally and people who are concerned about reproductive justice personally, that these are intersecting populations. In fact, these issues impact everyone, but I want to be very clear that it's not just one or the other. There are a number of common themes in terms of things that these movements are working towards, and that includes autonomy, access, especially access to healthcare, dignity, respect, parenting, as well as, and specifically on parenting, seeking dignity and support for parenting for those who may be presumed unfit to parent, right? Both movements argue the dignity of everyone to parent. And then I also want to just open up, actually, that if you have other things you'd like to share that you believe are commonalities between the disability rights and the reproductive justice movements or points of intersection, feel free to chat those into the chat box, and I'd be glad to call them out. So I'll give you about a moment to do that. All right, I'm not seeing chats coming in, so hopefully that means that there's some good agreement on some of the points that I raised. All right, so next I want to talk about the intersections of disability rights and reproductive justice in terms of activism, which is incredibly important to us at Reproaction as an organization that is focused on action, and especially direct action is one of the tools in our toolbox. We are huge admirers of the group named ADAPT, which focuses on justice for people with disabilities and has a long storied history of using civil disobedience and other forms of direct action to meet its goals. This picture that we're looking at right here is a woman arrested outside of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's office protesting cuts to Medicaid last year. And at that time, roughly 60 activists staged a die-in, and there were images populating the news of activists being dragged out of their wheelchairs, literally by the police. And this sort of principled activism that was undertaken by disability rights activists was some of the only things that cut through the clutter when conservatives were brutally attacking access to healthcare. So I want to lift up that it's also about activism, and the leadership of people with disabilities is very strong for the entire progressive movement, whether or not that's being acknowledged as much as it should be by the progressive movement, which I argue it is not. Okay, next I'd like to talk a little bit at a top line about reproductive health issues and people with disabilities. And we could have an entire webinar focused just on this, but I want to cover some of the high points. So first, a very important issue is access to sex education and healthcare for people with disabilities, including the full range of reproductive health services. And so that includes things as basic as examination, furnishings, and equipment that accommodates people with disabilities, and also, and especially, doctors who will treat their patients with dignity and respect. And that is an issue that we see happening time and again, that in fact, even reproductive healthcare providers that pride themselves and present themselves in one way aren't necessarily always living up to their values and providing the care that people with disabilities need. So another intersection is, or another thing I'd like to talk about is presumptions by health professionals and educators that people with disabilities are not sexual. This is something that it seems absolutely bananas if you think about it, that we wouldn't understand that everyone wouldn't understand that people with disabilities are people first, right? And sexuality is part of the human condition, and it's part of our lives and our capacity for joy, and nobody should be denied that, and nobody is exempt from those urges. But I want to bring up another intersection of how this plays out. So right now in our country, we have a crisis in terms of privatization of public services. And in particular, in many cases, what we're seeing is at both the federal, state, and even at the municipal levels is a redirecting of public service dollars to faith-based institutions. And when that becomes a problem here is some of those institutions may treat sexuality for people with disabilities within their care as something deviant or even criminal. And I'm saying this actually with direct experience, having heard someone from an organization, a faith-based organization that provided services to people with disabilities, when talking about two different people who were involved in their care, who were in a consensual adult relationship, started bringing up the context of crime. And so I think this is another area where we need to be really watchful, is making sure that health professionals, educators, and even service providers are giving people with disabilities the information and sexual health care and dignity and respect that they deserve. Another huge area, and this could be an entire webinar in itself, are caregiving barriers for people with disabilities. And especially I want to underscore forced sterilization. Now there is this infamous Supreme Court case that still stands, unfortunately. It has not been struck down. And that case is Buck v. Bell, which was decided in 1927. And there was a woman named Carrie Buck who was involuntarily sterilized in my home state of Virginia after being assumed to have inherited traits pinned to her mother, including being, quote, feeble-minded, unquote, and promiscuous, quote, unquote. And at the time, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said this horrific thing. He said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And as a result of the Buck v. Bell case, we know that 65,000 people with mental illness or developmental disabilities were subject to compulsory sterilization by the U.S. between the time period of the 1920s to the 1970s. And that's just a fact and stat that we know now. Like I said, that case has not been overturned. and it's very likely that there's more happening. So this is a gross violation of people's human rights and something that is absolutely a reproductive justice issue. Another thing that I want to touch on is abortion and disability. And first, I want to be clear, and we'll hear more about this from Jack, our first panelist, but just as people with disabilities need access to reproductive health care, people with disabilities also need access to abortion, right? Abortion is part of comprehensive healthcare access. And that's something that's not often talked about. Rather, on the flip side, typically when we talk about abortion and disability, it's in the case of a recent trend of Down syndrome-specific abortion bans as well as fetal anomaly-specific abortion bans. And recently, Ohio made headlines for passing a bill that would have made abortion a felony on the count of, or on the side of abortion providers if there is, quote, reason to believe that an unborn child has Down syndrome, unquote. And that law has been blocked by a judge, although Governor John Kasich did sign it into the law. And similar laws for fetal anomalies have previously passed in Indiana and North Dakota. And I want to be clear that while genetic testing and abortion of fetuses that may be born with disabilities, if carried fully to term, is a key source of tension between the disability rights and reproductive health rights and justice movements, we do have some common values between both movements. And I want to be clear again, it's not a source of tension for everybody in each of those movements, but it's absolutely a source of tension, and we should, I believe that we should lean into that. I want to reference for you that the organization that Amanda McCray, another one of our panelists tonight, works for. I did a project, a year-long project, working to bring together people in the disability rights movement and people in the reproductive rights movement together to have some difficult conversations in a safe space. And so what I want to share with you, while those were confidential conversations, what I want to share with you is some top lines from that work, because they were incredibly special and frank conversations. And one thing that everyone was able to agree on is that banning abortion or interfering with a person's access to information about their own pregnancy does not accomplish any of these goals, right? So that the banning abortion does not provide greater access to healthcare, does not provide greater supports for people with disabilities, does not provide greater information and to parents who are expecting children with disabilities, and that there is an urgent need to have more open, frank, and vulnerable conversation and movement building between, within, and across disability rights and justice movements and reproductive health rights and justice movements. And that includes creating and fostering safe spaces for that to happen intentionally. That's another reason why we're doing this webinar tonight with Reproaction, and we're really excited to do so. And then one other thing that I want to highlight as we're facing this trend is that the anti-abortion movement is painting itself as the friend of people with disabilities, when in fact it is working to take away access to healthcare that people with disabilities need to survive and thrive. And so there is an accountability piece that's absolutely missing, but there's no question that focusing and painting itself as the guardians of people with disabilities, by doing so, the anti-abortion movement, it's one of their primary strategies for banning abortion today at the federal as well as the state level. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about genetic testing and abortion bans as well. So in addition to these abortion bans, efforts to bar access to genetic testing information to women and gender nonconforming people who are pregnant. And as I shared, for these common values across movements, it's the autonomy and dignity, it's access to information, including access to information about a pregnancy and access to information about parenting a child with disabilities. So that's a key area where what we find is that what people have found is that for example, genetic counselors may not have all the information to provide to people who are pregnant about what real life looks like when you're parenting a child with disabilities, and that would be something that would be really helpful. And again, underscoring that a common value across movements is strengthening the social safety net and improving access to healthcare for all people. So with that, I will pass it to Pamela, who will move into our panel discussion with Jack.
Thank you very much, Erin. So the first panelist is Jack Kimmy Gutierrez, who unfortunately is unable to join us in person, and they will be joining us as a virtual panelist. So I'm going to read off the questions, and then Jack was kind enough to provide responses in writing, which I will read off as well. So without further ado, first question. As an Afro-Latinx Boricua, genderqueer member of the We Testify Abortion Storyteller program, who also lives with disabilities, you have chosen to share your story of having an abortion in Florida and the unnecessary barriers you faced while doing so. What needs to change so people are treated with dignity when accessing abortion? Jack's answer: I want to mention that I do not identify myself as a genderqueer person. Queer, yes. Non-binary, yes. Trans, yes. But genderqueer never felt right for me. I believe a genuine effort to learn about the communities that are either forgotten or intentionally left out of reproductive justice abortion narratives is essential. Many organizations provide some sort of basic cultural competency or diversity training, but these are usually HR-led, and the leadership presenting the material often focuses on legality rather than the well-being of individuals. If you want to make your clinic a safe place for trans people, find a trans person to facilitate a training on gender. There are plenty of trans people who freelance and create educational programming to promote sensitivity. Hire them, pay them. When it comes to language, I wrote something a few years ago that might be helpful that you're welcome to share. Jack has provided us with an article titled 4 Ways to be Gender Inclusive When Discussing Abortion on Everyday Feminism, and we will include that article in the follow-up email to this webinar. The second question: you have made it a personal mission to ensure trans and gender nonconforming people are included in reproductive rights work. As a person who also experiences disability, do you believe that people with disabilities are also commonly left out of discussions about abortion access? If so, what can activists and leaders do to better include both trans and gender nonconforming people, as well as people with disabilities, including people with both identities? Jack's answer: I feel as if the common conversations around ability and abortion focus on the idea that disabled people shouldn't be reproducing, so abortion is an eventuality. And even that's when it is acknowledged that disabled people have sex lives. On top of that, it's important to distinguish that there are various kinds of disabilities that affect people in different ways. That means accessibility should be addressed in multiple ways. Would your clinic pass an ADA inspection? Do you have actuators on the door? Think about the check-in process and if someone with a cane or a wheelchair could successfully speak to a receptionist at the front desk. Occasionally, I use a cane for support, and I've noticed how quickly people infantilize me when my disability becomes visible. For some reason, offering me help when I have a cane also means repeatedly referring to me as ma'am or sweetie, or some bizarre variation that not only reminds me no one asked me my pronouns, but that somehow I'm now a child that needs to be taken care of. That surely doesn't help my anxiety around being misgendered or being touched by strangers. Question number 3. Reproaction has started a national campaign to generate conversation and raise awareness about self-managed abortion with pills. and when a person takes safe and effective medication to end a pregnancy while they're at home. Why is increasing access to medication abortion particularly important for people with disabilities? Jack's answer: it's important for trans and gender nonconforming people too. I had a medication abortion myself, and a lot of that choice revolved around privacy. People gawk at trans and disabled bodies. I didn't want to feel as if I'd become the subject of a study. Travel can be particularly difficult if you're disabled as well. So if you're able to get a pill from your local pharmacy or delivered with your other medications, you'd have an easier time. Bodies are complex, and our relationships with our bodies only get more complicated. A medication abortion can sometimes seem like a more natural alternative, and it's every individual's right to have that option. And with that, I will turn it back over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Jack. And again, if you have questions related to that, feel free to type in questions into the box, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. All right, with that, I'm very excited to introduce our next panelist, who is David Perry. He is a journalist and writer, a fantastic one, based in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, where I'm also from originally, and he is Lollard Fish on Twitter. David, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. So my first question for you is, you are the parent of a son with Down syndrome, and you write about that frequently. What needs to change in society so that we are able to live up to the part of the reproductive justice vision where everyone has the right to raise their families with dignity in safe and healthy communities?
I mean, it's a really deep question, and I've been thinking about how to talk about that sort of big vision question. First we have to talk about safe and healthy communities across all communities. We have to think about all the ways in which communities are rendered not safe. But thinking more about the raising families with dignity, right? I have spent a lot of time considering and writing about the tensions between disability communities and reproductive justice communities, one of which I have been involved in reproductive justice really my whole adult and teenage life. I became more involved in the disability rights world and disability justice world when my son was born 11 years ago, and trying to think about the different conversations happening in just these two spheres, as happen in many different spheres just on the left, where people aren't communicating with each other, where one group is really sure they know what the other group should be doing but not listening, and vice versa. So one of the things I've been trying to do with my writing is be an interlocutor, particularly where I reach out to people within the disability rights world and try to lift up their voices so other people in other communities can hear them, so we can see exactly the kinds of things you were talking about in your really very good beginning, where we can talk about the rights of disabled people to be parents or sexually active. I'm a big fan of Robin Powell at disabledparenting.com. That's a place everyone should go. Rebecca Coakley, who's at the Center for American Progress. These are two people who've written about that. The right to be sexually active, the complexities of me thinking about my son, this 11-year-old boy who is just now in 5th grade, entering the world of curriculum about sexual activity and making sure that it's appropriate for him. But then at the same time, having the disability rights world understand that there's a whole group of people, again, as you said, who want to use disability as a wedge to attack reproductive rights. And not only is that bad because reproductive rights matter on their own sake, but it's a problem for just the disability community, that there is no disability justice without reproductive justice.
Wow, thank you for that, David. So much to chew on in what you just shared. And in particular, I'm also here on there is no disability justice without reproductive justice. I also just want to underscore again that I'm very excited to look deeper into Robin Powell at disabledparenting.com and also see more of Rebecca Coakley's fabulous work. So thank you for lifting up those voices as well. So you talked a bit about your writing and already, and I want to reference here that as a journalist, you wrote a piece for The Nation that was excellent about how conservatives are using fears of eugenics to attack reproductive rights. And specifically, conservatives are claiming abortion is being used to perpetuate a, quote, genocide, unquote, against people with Down syndrome. Recently, a judge in Ohio blocked an abortion ban that banned abortion for Down syndrome. So please walk us through it. What's wrong with these laws and lines of argument?
So one of the things I would like people on this webinar to know is that over the last few years, the last database I looked at showed that 15 different states have proposed bills like the one that was passed in Ohio. Mostly they've died in various committees, but not in all cases. And it is one of the lines of attack in the constant incremental drive to restrict reproductive access are these specific issues, really trying to deploy people like me, suburban parents, white suburban parents, reasonably well off, our incredibly cute children, using our children as sort of these objects, which is not an unusual thing obviously in the anti-choice movement. On these displays, we just saw that in Ireland too. A big part of the campaign in Ireland was using these images of kids with Down syndrome, which fortunately failed. So I would like people to understand that there is a systemic attack on reproductive rights using these disability issues and specifically using Down syndrome. Now, as many people on this webinar probably know, Down syndrome is something you can test for in a prenatal context. It's a pretty common genetic abnormality, though far from the only one. It tends to result, there are lots of genetic abnormalities, but many of them result in miscarriage. Pretty commonly, Down syndrome doesn't. So everyone here knows someone with Down syndrome, whether you know you do or not. No one is very far in sort of the 6 degrees of separation from someone with Down syndrome from a family like mine. What's happening with these laws is that there is a real complicated cultural issue in terms of how people respond to the words Down syndrome with panic and fear, and often rush to make decisions about what they will do with their pregnancy based on that panic and fear. And so there's a pro-information movement which talks about trying to make sure that people, when they hear the words Down syndrome, it's not just a phone call, well, it's Down syndrome, come on into the clinic, but it's immediately they are given access to information. These laws work against that pro-information approach. What they do, and they vary across the states, but by and large, what they do is they criminalize an abortion if it's performed with the doctor knowing the reason behind the abortion has to do with a prenatal test. So what that won't do is reduce the numbers of these eugenic abortions. What it will do is make it harder for pregnant people to talk about what's going on, to seek good information, to communicate with trusted healthcare professionals, because as soon as they say, I'm thinking about an abortion because of these tests, they're entering a world of criminalization rather than a world of healthcare and advice and support. So the laws will not help people with Down syndrome who are alive today. They will also almost certainly not change the rate of abortion. All they will do is criminalize speech around abortion and make it harder to have these necessary and often very difficult conversations.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to underscore as well that what a key strategy this is, as you lifted up in the beginning of your answer, of the anti-abortion movement and chipping away at abortion access absent a total ban. And the assault, this line of assault is, I believe it is only going to get much louder. I will say that I notice it feels like once every week or two, I will see an opinion piece in a major op-ed or in a major newspaper where it's deploying this line of argument from conservatives. So it's not just an attack that's happening concerted within the states. It's clear that the right wing is activated and embracing this message, not just in the United States, but around the world, as you mentioned with Ireland. So thank you for that. And my final question for you, and please feel free to type in as many questions in the chat box that you have now for David. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. My final question for you here during this portion of the panel discussion is about prenatal genetic testing. And this is an important issue and sometimes a source of tension between advocates for disability rights and advocates for reproductive rights. But as I mentioned, there's this organized right wing that does not support policy for either disability rights or reproductive rights. And they are also working to allow genetic counselors to refuse to tell women and gender nonconforming people information about their pregnancies. And in some states, they have succeeded. This actually happened in my home state of Virginia, where a conscience clause that was written directly by an affiliate for the Family Research Council, which has been designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, that they were able to ramrod through, even with the acceptance of members of the left that were in the legislature. They were able to ramrod through a conscience clause that included not only did it allow genetic counselors to refuse to provide information to people if they suspected it might lead to abortion, but there was no timeliness aspect. So they didn't even have to tell them, I'm not telling you something, or I'm not telling you something, and tell you that, within a reasonable time frame. So they could just completely go dark and not share that information. So my question to you is on this question of genetic testing, which is quite controversial. How can we start to work together better across movements to ensure that everyone is able to access information about their pregnancy, including information about the potential for disability in a timely and supported way?
I think this is really one of the critical areas in which we need to work on the left at this communication. So that's why I'm glad to be here. When I talk to the disability rights folks, particularly other parents, where it's really sort of my community, I talk about bodily autonomy and the necessary focus on bodily autonomy. When it comes to disability, that includes access to abortion, access to abortion for disabled people, also reproductive access to being a parent is another part, or sex as part of the bodily autonomy. So I'm trying to push the disability world to think about bodily autonomy as a core value. When I talk to the reproductive justice world, I hope that folks understand why my community is concerned about eugenic abortion. And I need us to see that it is a problem when someone chooses to terminate based on a prenatal diagnosis in a condition of ignorance and fear. And I know the tensions around, there are laws that have been passed around sort of full disclosure to someone after a prenatal diagnosis. And I tend to think those are pretty big laws, good laws rather. As soon as they were passed, though, the anti-choice movement hijacked them and said, well, you can't mention abortion, just what you're talking about. So we are in constant risk of of seeing our alliances taken aside. But I do need us to understand that prenatal testing places us in positions of making decisions based on probabilities, based on biases, based on that are pretty scary, that we have this tradition of people being afraid of disability, being afraid of reproduction in particular around disability and this history of eugenics that you articulated, and to recognize that as a valid concern and to join with the disability rights movement in trying to help people understand that disability is not inherently a source of terror, that disabled lives are worth living, that people with disabilities and their families and communities need support, that disability falls along the other axis of trying to build a more just society, that fighting ableism is part of the campaign against fighting patriarchy, against fighting racism, that these are oppressive forces that intersect and work together. So to see our fights as all part of the same fight, that's pretty abstract. And when we start to get more into the details, it's about, I think, really focusing on the one hand, the disability rights world saying, we will not be hijacked to take away access to reproductive justice, and the reproductive justice world saying, we will not be so afraid of disability that we allow eugenics and eugenic thinking to propagate through our ranks.
Thank you, David. This has been a substantive and very enlightening and enriching conversation. So At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Pamela so that she can do the next Q&A with Amanda McCray, but I want to encourage everyone to type in as many questions as you have for David into the chat box. And thank you again, David.
Thank you so much, Erin and David. So I will be chatting with Amanda McCray, who is the Director of United Nations Advocacy at Women Enabled International. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi there. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. So please tell us about Women Enabled International and your work.
Sure. Women Enabled is a global non-governmental organization that seeks to advocate and educate on the rights of women and girls with disabilities around the world. Our team is made up primarily of lawyers, and particularly international human rights lawyers. So the tool that we use in our toolbox is international human rights law. And we use that to try to ensure that women and girls with disabilities are empowered to embrace their rights. And so when I talk about international human rights law, I'm talking about 9 treaties that have been negotiated by UN member states at the United Nations itself that outline a series of rights for all people. Countries voluntarily ratify these treaties, sign on to them, and agree to be held by the rights that are enumerated within them. All 9 of these treaties apply to women and girls with disabilities. And when I say women and girls with disabilities, I'm talking about a broad understanding of that concept, including people who identify as women or girls, but also people who may be perceived as being women and girls and therefore suffer human rights violations based on that perception. But 2 of the international human rights treaties that have been put together out of these 9 are specifically salient for women and girls with disabilities. One of those is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we call CRPD, and the other one is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is a long title, but we just call it CEDAW. And these treaties provide specific rights that are quite detailed that affect all sorts of groups of people with disabilities and women, and include several rights specifically about sexual and reproductive health and rights and reproductive justice. So what we do at Women Enabled, we're quite a small organization, but growing rapidly. We focus our work on 3 primary areas. One is norm development. So it's taking the international human rights law that exists and trying to create understandings of that law that apply specifically to women and girls with disabilities and fully protect their rights. Then we take those norms and we do UN advocacy. So we go to the United Nations and we talk with human rights experts there and states there and encourage them to adopt the strongest possible legal norms surrounding the rights of women and girls with disabilities. And then finally, a really big aspect of our work and a growing aspect of it is movement building. We're trying to connect women and girls with disabilities from around the world and make sure that they have the tools for themselves to advocate at the national level, at the local level, for their rights and be able to learn from each other and their various experiences. So we've done some limited work in the US, but our work is global. So we've been working with women and girls with disabilities from around the world, but I think that also really informs the work that we're doing in the United States as well.
Wow, thank you for that. That's amazing. So you touched on this a bit, but if you could go a little deeper into why the creation and implementation of international human rights law, particularly important for women with disabilities, both in the United States and around the world.
Sure. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that countries, when they're themselves adopting laws to try to ensure women's rights or the rights of persons with disabilities, they frequently aren't necessarily including women and girls with disabilities in their thought process. They're not thinking about the rights issues that may disproportionately affect them or uniquely affect them because of their gender, because of their disability, and because of other identities that they might have. And as a result, we find that laws and policies often don't reflect those issues at all when they are adopted, and therefore when states, when I would use the word states here, I'm talking about countries, not US states, so apologize for that. But countries, when they implement those laws, aren't really thinking about women and girls with disabilities either, such that they're pretty much left out of the conversation. So a couple of examples of where that happens, touching on some information that folks have already talked about in the presentation. But laws and policies, for instance, on forced sterilization, if a country adopts a policy prohibiting the sterilization of a person who could become pregnant without that person's consent, they often don't really think about women and girls with disabilities, and they may still become sterilized. And the reason for that is because frequently women and girls with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities or mental health related disabilities, are deprived of legal capacity or the right to make legal decisions on their own behalf, and they may have a guardian appointed to make those decisions for them, or a judge might make those decisions, or a doctor. And because there is somebody put in that person's place to make a decision for that person to undergo sterilization, the law that otherwise prohibits forced sterilization doesn't prohibit sterilization of them, even though those women aren't giving their own consent for that sterilization. Or in many cases, girls, or a parent will be giving consent and the girl herself is not consulted regarding sterilization. And so these laws and policies that are meant to protect women from what is considered a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, this forced reproductive health procedure that takes away their ability to ever have children, ends up not getting applied to women and girls with disabilities because they're not thinking of those things in tandem. Another place where we see this is policies designed to ensure sexual and reproductive health services, for instance, frequently aren't thinking about women and girls with disabilities when they're designed. And so you end up with situations where doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals aren't trained to work with people with disabilities, have ingrained stereotypes about them. You also get situations where facilities and medical equipment are not accessible to people with disabilities. And you get situations where there are significant communication barriers between people with disabilities and their healthcare providers. So we've seen, for instance, in Poland, our partners there report that women and girls with disabilities who become pregnant and go through the labor and delivery system will find that the nurses dealing with them, the doctors dealing with them, are really judgmental of them for their decision to become pregnant and have a child because there's a possibility of passing on a disability. And because of that, they're treated quite poorly. And they're also seen kind of as like medical anomalies, such that they're monitored very closely. They bring all the residents around to check on them and look at them and examine them as a person with a disability who's just had a child. So it can be quite overwhelming in that situation when people aren't trained to be sensitive to issues affecting disability. So to get around to the substance of your question, what does international human rights law do in these types of situations, is it provides a framework that frequently doesn't exist in national law for understanding the gaps in national law that often exist surrounding women and girls with disabilities. The people who developed this international human rights law, experts out there in the field, human rights experts, frankly listen a little bit more to civil society organizations and to marginalized groups as compared to the countries that frequently adopt the laws. And because of that, they hear the perspective of women and girls with disabilities who often are left out of conversations at the national level. And because these international human rights experts then will assess a country's record on the rights of persons with disabilities, on the rights of women, et cetera, they are then providing direct recommendations to those states that will impact how those countries implement their laws and policies and ensure that women and girls with disabilities are included there. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
No, that was incredibly helpful and detailed. So thank you so much. We just have a few minutes left in our section, but I wanted to get to my final question, which is, with your background and your experience in advocacy and research around the world, you must have some amazing stories to illustrate what happens when we follow and respect the leadership of women with disabilities. So what can you tell us in the few moments that we have left? What can you tell us about how women with disabilities are advancing human rights?
So I'll stick to just one very short example, and it's a really exciting one because it's happening right now. In Poland right now, there are a couple of movements that affect women and girls with disabilities, one surrounding access to abortion, and abortion particularly in a case of what they call, quote unquote, fetal impairment. But there's also a movement, the disability rights community, wherein they are trying to seek because so many people with disabilities are unemployed and have very little access to education in Poland to try to get greater employment. They're requesting a slight increase in their pension from the government. And there have been massive protests at the parliament in Poland because of that. What we're seeing from that movement is that women with disabilities, and one of our partners in particular, are really rising to the top. And having their voices being heard most loudly. They're able to speak, particularly from the perspective of their gender on disability rights issues, but as women with disabilities on the abortion rights issues too, and able to kind of bridge gaps between those two movements to find some common ground and some solidarity. And they're also in the process really becoming a women with disabilities movement themselves, and that's been really, really exciting to see. So that's playing out right now in Poland. We're not really sure exactly where it's going to go, but if you're interested in that topic, definitely keep your eye on the news about Poland.
I sure will. Thank you so much. That's very exciting, and thank you so much, Amanda. So stick around, and Erin's going to go through next steps, and then we'll have the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you so much, Amanda. Okay, so I would be remiss as an activist organization if we didn't talk about improving our activist spaces. And I'm talking specifically from the standpoint of repro health rights and justice movements. And some questions to ask yourself. So one, are people with disabilities in your activist groups? If not, take some time to reflect on that, because as Amanda so eloquently just put it, women with disabilities are rising to the top, and there are a number of highly effective leaders, and it's not just leaders that you see visibly, but also people who are doing the work on the ground, like that amazing photograph I shared earlier of the woman who was being arrested outside of Senate Majority Leader McConnell's office. So if they're not in your group, reflect. If so, please be intentional to follow and support their leadership. Another thing that's key that happens far too often within the left and within the reproductive movements in specific is meeting spaces that are not accessible to a person with physical disabilities. And so make sure that your meeting spaces are accessible. Are they only accessible by stairs, for instance? That's a huge issue. Is there an accessible restroom that people can use? Again, think really hard about this and make sure that you are meeting in spaces where people can go. An important thing to do is in conferences, this plays out. So before a conference, if you're organizing a conference, go through the Americans with Disabilities Act checklist for existing conference and meeting facilities. And please don't assume this applies to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but assume this for other disabilities as well. Don't ask if someone needs a sign language interpreter. Make arrangements for the service first and ask later, right? By putting the onus on people with disabilities to announce themselves before making our spaces accessible, we are in fact not creating accessible spaces. Another important thing is online actions and communications, to make accommodations for people who use screen readers. So this is something that's really important, and we are working intentionally on that here at Reproaction as well. It's been the topic of many internal staff calls. But there are, now that so much of online content is actually shared through images, those are typically not accessible to screen readers, and so there are huge swaths of people who are unable to read and digest your content. So what you can do, for example, on websites, you can do alt image text. So in other words, it's like the text that shows up if an image can't be read. And that way you can make your online actions accessible. And then with direct action spaces, be intentional. So I don't have a checklist here, but for example, we were talking internally, and I want to lift up our campaign lead, Shireen Shakuri, for being so intentional about this. When we were preparing for a rally outside the Supreme Court earlier this year regarding the Nifla v. Becerra case, which is a case currently concerning California's Reproductive Fact Act and an attempt to hold anti-abortion fake clinics or crisis pregnancy centers in check. We had a big rally plan with a number of coalition partners. And thanks to Shireen and Reproaction's work, we were able to think intentionally about making sure that the rally was more accessible. So it can even be as simple as thinking, you know, is there a space where I can put a few folding chairs where it's easy or more accessible for someone who needs to sit can go, or making sure that there's space for people who are in wheelchairs, making sure that if we're doing a big speech, again, that there's interpretation. So please just think about this and be intentional. And next, on to next steps. Please also sign up to plug into Reproaction campaigns. One of the campaigns mentioned on this call was our work on self-managed abortion. We run these Act and Learn webinars every single month, and they're free and open to the public, and are designed to help us dig in deeper to topics, connect activists, do skills training, and more. So if you sign up at reproaction.org, you won't miss a thing. And then you can follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then finally, before passing it to Pamela for Q&A, I'd urge you to save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar, which will be on Wednesday, June 27th. And our topic is Immigration is a Reproductive Justice Issue. And this couldn't be more timely with the detention of a number of our activists in our movements. So I'm really looking forward to that. And with that, I'll pass it to Pamela for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Erin. So as we mentioned at the beginning and throughout, if you have questions, please do drop them in the question tab at your GoToWebinar control panel. So the first question that we have, I'm going to address it to Amanda, but then David, you can also answer. But this is from a attendee who wanted to know if we can address those of us who have genetic disabilities that we know have a high probability of passing on, especially for those of us who know what we are risking sentencing or our potential children to, not to mention the impact risk it can pose to our health. So I'll pose it first to Amanda and then to David.
Sorry about that. Just needed a second to unmute. I think that's a really interesting question. And as someone with a disability that also is genetic, it's something that has applied to me quite recently. I had a child about 16 months ago, and that was something that we also had to think about. I think an important thing is that you feel empowered and like you have the ability to make whatever choice you want to make in terms of pregnancy, access to information, and then a decision whether or not to continue that pregnancy based on that information. It's such an important, when we talk about abortion, we're often not thinking about women and girls with disabilities or other people who can become pregnant who have disabilities. But the ability to access information for those individuals is also really, really key. At the same time, I hope society as a whole doesn't stigmatize people with disabilities who choose to have children who may also then have disabilities. I know in my case, I certainly dealt with at least one doctor who really wanted me to get genetic testing that I didn't feel like I needed to identify whether or not my son would have the gene that I have related to my visual disability. And for me, it was something that, I live with and I do fine with, and that if my son has it, that he, I think, can also live in the world and do fine as well. But it's not necessarily something that our doctors understand beyond the thinking about disability as a medical issue. So that's also something I think a lot of women and girls with disabilities have to think about, and other people who can become pregnant with disabilities have to think about in terms of their medical care related to their pregnancies too.
Thank you for that. David? Ooh, David, are you on mute? Okay, so while we're waiting to figure out what the sound situation is with David, and hopefully we'll get him back, but we have a few minutes more. So we did have another question pop up, and we can always circle back to that one again. But this question is, how do you conceptualize folks with mental illness within the disability framework? This attendee has been accustomed to thinking of them separately, but others have shared that they're not so separate. Is treating mental illness as a type of disability co-opting that movement or stepping out of line? Amanda, are you there?
Sorry, I keep muting myself and then taking a minute to unmute. Maybe I'll just stay unmuted. So there is a movement of people with quote unquote mental illness. They identify themselves primarily as being people with psychosocial disabilities, sometimes users and survivors of psychiatry, and other labels that they self-adopt. They are included in the disability rights movement to the extent that they wish to be, but the disability rights movement is also one that folks kind of self-identify and include themselves in. So it doesn't necessarily have to co-opt messages of a movement that wishes to remain separate or people who wish to remain separate from it. One other area that we see this in as well is that many people with HIV or AIDS are also people with disabilities or identify as being people with disabilities. And so adopt the rights of people with disabilities as they exist and seek to promote those rights. But many people with HIV and AIDS don't wish to identify as people with disabilities, particularly because sometimes, unfortunately, disability is a stigmatized identity, as is being a person with HIV or AIDS as well. And so having both of those stigmatized identities, sometimes people don't feel empowered by it. They feel neglected by it. So I think it's up to people with mental health issues, with psychosocial disabilities, to identify as they wish, but to know that the movement, the disability rights movement, does accept and does very much include people with psychosocial disabilities in it to the extent they wish to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for that answer. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to take moderator privilege. And I'm just curious for your thoughts. My older brother is autistic, and so I've learned so much about the activism and self-advocacy that is going on from Twitter and from following various accounts. I think David mentioned, and we also shared them on Twitter, some awesome activists to follow. And it's just been such a tremendous learning experience for me, and also a way for me to tap in a way that's helpful and not harmful. So if you could just in a couple of minutes that we have left, just talk about the role that that social media has played in helping to amplify, and I'm projecting there, I'm assuming amplify, the activism that's going on. Amanda, did you mute again?
Yes, okay, sorry about that. So yeah, social media, I think, has been a really valuable tool for amplifying the voices of people with disabilities and women and girls with disabilities in particular. And I think one way that it's been so valuable is that it's allowed participation in broader conversations that women and girls with disabilities are otherwise excluded from sometimes. So for instance, the Me Too movement being very much a social media movement, many of its aspects, has allowed women and girls with disabilities to contribute their own life experiences and their own kind of unique perspectives on issues surrounding sexual harassment and sexual violence that I think are being heard loud and clear in a way that those lived experiences have never really been heard before. And so to the degree that social media is a tool for that, that's really amazing. And also just people with disabilities generally live frequently so on the margins in many places around the world. In the US, a little bit less so, but in many places around the world, people don't know that they know people with disabilities, or they don't know anyone with a disability, and they've never encountered a person with a disability. And so social media has also given people with disabilities the opportunity to just become visible more generally. And when they're sharing their life experiences, when they're showing their abilities through social media, their ability to advocate for themselves and tell their own stories, that has a really massive impact, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so we'd like to take this time to thank Amanda, Jack, and David for just a wonderful and thoughtful conversation. As always, thank my partner in activism for taking the lead on this webinar, and we want to thank our attendees for contributing such great questions to this process. So thank you, and follow us at Reproaction on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Everybody have a great night.